She was exhausted, hungry, and racing home to a sick child when she saw him lying on the sidewalk, ignored by everyone who passed. A homeless man, barely breathing, right in front of a mansion that screamed wealth and comfort. She had almost nothing left, yet she stopped. What she gave him would cost her dearly, and what she didn't know about who he really was would change her life forever. But this story isn't just about kindness. It's about who gets seen, who gets ignored, and how racism decides that every single day. Would you have stopped or walked away like the rest? Before we go back, let us know where you're watching from. And if you're new, subscribe to our channel Stories of Racism and connect with us for daily new stories. Because tomorrow I've got something extra special for you. Angela Brooks lived her life on a schedule so tight there was no room for mistakes. Every minute mattered. Every dollar mattered more. She woke up before the sun, not because she was ambitious, but because survival demanded it. Her days began in a cramped apartment with peeling paint and a floor that never fully warmed, even in summer. The first thing she did every morning was check on her son. Ethan was 6, small for his age, his breathing often shallow, his chest rising and falling with the help of a humming machine that never quite let Angela forget how fragile everything was. Angela's world revolved around motion. If she kept moving, she didn't have time to think. She worked the morning shift at a diner where customers rarely learned her name and sometimes refused to look at her face. By afternoon, she was already thinking about the second job waiting for her later that night. Long hours, aching feet, hands cracked from chemicals she couldn't afford gloves to protect against. This was her normal. Exhaustion wasn't an emergency. Hunger wasn't a crisis. It was routine. She didn't dream anymore. Dreams belonged to people with rest, with security, with the luxury of imagining a future instead of just bracing for the next bill. Angela measured her life in small victories. The lights stayed on another week. The rent notice hadn't turned into an eviction yet. Ethan made it through another night without coughing until he cried. That was enough. It had to be. The world around her, however, was never quiet. It reminded her constantly of what she was. On her walk home each day, she passed streets lined with old trees and iron gates, the kind that guarded houses too large for one family and too quiet to feel alive. She avoided looking at them when she could. Not because she wanted what they had, but because they made her feel invisible, like someone passing through a life that wasn't meant for her. Angela had learned early that being a black woman meant being noticed and ignored at the same time. Watched closely, trusted rarely, expected to work harder, complain less, and accept whatever scraps were handed down with a smile. People assumed things about her without asking. They always did. And over time, she learned the safest way to exist was to keep her head down and her steps steady. On this particular day, nothing felt different at first. Her shift ended the same way it always did, with sore muscles and a body running on empty. The only thing unusual was the weight in her bag. Food, real food. A rare kindness she hadn't planned for. It should have been a good thing. It should have meant relief. Instead, it felt fragile, like something that could be taken away at any moment. She chose the fastest route home, the one that cut through the historic district. It saved time, even if it meant walking past places that made her feel small. She was already calculating the rest of the night in her head. Dinner, medicine, another shift, sleep if there was time. Tomorrow would be the same, that's what she believed. Angela didn't know that this ordinary walk was about to collide with a truth she'd been living with her entire life. A truth about who society chooses to see, about whose suffering is ignored, about how kindness can feel dangerous when the world has taught you that stopping often comes at a cost. She didn't know that just a few steps ahead, something would force her to make a choice that no schedule could prepare her for. A choice that would expose the quiet cruelty woven into everyday life. A choice that would pull her into a story far bigger than herself. And once she stopped walking, nothing would ever be normal again. Angela had learned to read the city the way some people read weather. She knew which streets were safe to linger on and which demanded speed. She could sense when eyes followed her a little too long, when a glance carried judgment instead of curiosity. None of it surprised her anymore. It was background noise, woven so deeply into daily life that noticing it felt pointless. You adapted, or you broke. She walked with her shoulders slightly forward, not defeated, just practiced. The posture of someone who had learned that taking up less space invited fewer questions. Her shoes were worn thin at the heels, each step sending a dull ache up her legs, but she kept her pace steady. Stopping meant thinking, and thinking meant feeling. She didn't have room for either. As she moved through the neighborhood, the contrast sharpened. Perfect lawns trimmed to lines so straight they looked artificial. Windows that glowed warmly even in daylight. Security cameras angled outward, watching the sidewalk more carefully than the people who lived inside ever would. These streets weren't built for people like Angela. They were built to keep certain people out while pretending to be open to everyone. She noticed how passers-by adjusted when they saw her. Some crossed the street. Some clutched their bags tighter. Others didn't look at her at all, as if ignoring her presence was a form of protection. None of it was new. It was just another reminder that no matter how tired she was, no matter how hard she worked, she would always be judged before she was known. Her thoughts drifted back to Ethan, to the sound of his breathing in the mornings, the way she watched his chest rise just to reassure herself he was still there. She told herself that as long as he was alive, she could handle anything else. Pain, hunger, humiliation. Those were temporary. Losing him would not be. That belief was the only thing that kept her moving forward when everything else threatened to pull her under. Angela's phone buzzed in her pocket, but she ignored it. Probably another reminder, another notice, another quiet warning that something needed to be paid or fixed or handled immediately. The world never waited for her to catch her breath. It only demanded more. She tightened her grip on her bag. The weight of it grounded her, a rare sense of control. For tonight, at least, there would be food. For tonight, Ethan would eat without her measuring portions in her head. That thought alone was enough to keep her going. She was almost past the largest estate on the block when something felt wrong. Not loud, not dramatic, just wrong. The kind of wrong that makes your body react before your mind does. Her steps slowed, then stopped. Angela didn't turn right away. She hesitated, caught between instinct and survival. She knew what stopping usually meant: delay, trouble, attention. But she also knew that some moments didn't let you walk past without consequence. This neighborhood saw everything except suffering. Pain didn't fit the aesthetic. It was easier to look away, to label discomfort as someone else's responsibility. Angela had seen it her entire life, how compassion often stopped where convenience ended. She took a breath and finally looked. Whatever she saw next would test everything she believed about strength, about kindness, and about what it meant to be invisible in plain sight. It would force her to confront a choice that the world rarely offered people like her without a price attached. And though she didn't realize it yet, this moment, this pause on a quiet, wealthy street, was the last moment of her life that belonged only to her. Because once she stepped forward, the line between who she was and how the world treated her was about to become painfully clear. Angela stood frozen at the edge of the sidewalk, her body tense, her instincts screaming at her to keep moving. Stopping had never been part of her survival strategy. In her world, stopping invited questions, suspicion, and consequences she could rarely afford. Yet something in front of her refused to be ignored. A human shape lay crumpled near the iron gate of the largest mansion on the block, placed there like an inconvenience someone hoped would disappear if left long enough. The man looked wrong against the backdrop of wealth. His clothes were torn and thin, his body folded inward as if trying to conserve warmth that no longer existed. His skin carried the dull gray tone of someone who had been without food for too long. This wasn't someone resting. This was someone collapsing. And still, the street kept moving. People passed him without slowing. Shoes clicked against the pavement, polished and purposeful. A man in a tailored suit glanced down briefly, his expression tightening with irritation rather than concern, then stepped around the body as if avoiding a stain. A couple followed soon after, their attention fixed forward, their discomfort masked by distance. No one stopped. No one knelt. No one asked if he was alive. Angela watched it happen in real time, her chest tightening with each passerby. She recognized the pattern instantly. This was how society treated people it deemed disposable, poor, old, homeless, unprofitable. She had felt the edge of that label her entire life, hovering close enough to touch but never quite swallowing her whole. This man had crossed fully into it. She told herself to keep walking. She needed to get home. Ethan was waiting. Time mattered. Energy mattered. And yet her feet refused to move. She noticed the cardboard sign near the man's hand, half flipped against the concrete. The words were simple, uneven, desperate. A request for food. Not money, not pity, food. That detail lodged itself in her chest like a splinter. Hunger recognized hunger. Angela became painfully aware of the bag at her side. The weight of it suddenly felt heavier, no longer comfort but responsibility. For hours she had been holding onto the promise of that food, using it as fuel to get through the rest of the day. Now it felt like a test she hadn't asked to take. Her mind raced through consequences. If she stopped, she would lose time. If she gave anything away, she would go hungry again. Hunger meant weakness. Weakness meant mistakes. Mistakes meant bills unpaid and shifts missed. The system had taught her that kindness was a luxury reserved for people with safety nets. But the system had also taught her something else, that people like her were expected to endure quietly while others looked away. She knelt anyway. The concrete was cold through the fabric of her pants, rough against her skin. She reached out carefully, touching the man's shoulder. His body was colder than she expected, too still. Her heart jumped, panic flaring sharp and sudden. She leaned closer, searching for signs of breath. It was there, faint and uneven, like a thread threatening to snap. Around them, the world continued. Cars passed at the end of the street. A gate camera angled slightly, capturing everything without intervening. Angela felt exposed, hypervisible now that she had stopped. A black woman kneeling beside a collapsed man in front of a mansion. She knew how this looked. She knew how quickly concern could be twisted into suspicion. She checked his face, cracked lips, dried blood at the corner of his mouth, eyes half open but unfocused. He was conscious barely, alive but slipping. Angela hesitated for one final moment. This was the point of no return. Once she acted, there would be no pretending she hadn't seen him, no reclaiming the illusion of normalcy. She reached into her bag. The smell of food escaped as soon as she opened the container, rich and warm, cruelly vivid against her empty stomach. Her body reacted instantly, a wave of hunger crashing through her so strong it made her dizzy. She swallowed hard and pushed the sensation down. She had done that her whole life. She supported the man's head gently, lifting it just enough to help him swallow. She broke the food into small pieces, careful, deliberate. Each bite she gave away felt heavier than the last, not because of the loss, but because of what it represented. This food was meant to keep her standing, to keep her working, to keep her functioning in a system that offered no grace for exhaustion. The man's body responded slowly, at first barely at all. Then gradually something shifted. His breathing steadied. Color crept back into his skin. The change was subtle but unmistakable. Angela felt a fragile relief settle over her, followed almost immediately by fear. Because now people were watching. Not with compassion but curiosity, judgment. A few slowed their steps, some frowned, others whispered. Angela could feel their thoughts without hearing them. Why was she helping him? What was she doing there? Was this safe? Was this appropriate? She knew this gaze well. It was the same look she got when she stood too long in a store, when she questioned a charge, when she existed in spaces not designed with her in mind. The look that weighed intention against stereotype and always leaned toward suspicion. Still, she didn't stop. When the container was empty, her hands trembled. not just from hunger, but from the release of tension she had been holding since she knelt down. The man clutched the empty plastic like proof that something real had happened, that he hadn't imagined it. Angela reached into her pocket without thinking. The last of her cash. A small amount, but everything she had until the end of the week. She placed it into his hand, closing his fingers around it firmly, before doubt could intervene. Only then did she sit back on her heels, her body suddenly aware of how tired it truly was. She didn't notice the way the man's gaze lingered on her longer than expected. Didn't notice how his eyes, now clearer, took in her face with a focus that felt almost intentional. She was too busy trying to steady herself, to prepare for the long walk home with nothing left to give. What Angela didn't realize was that this moment had already been seen by more than just passing strangers, that the street she stood on was not only watched but recorded, and that the choice she had just made, out of instinct, out of empathy, had set something in motion far beyond her control. Because this was not just an act of kindness. It was the beginning of a reckoning. Angela walked away with her stomach empty and her mind louder than it had been all day. Every step toward home felt heavier than the last, not just because of hunger, but because she could feel the eyes that had followed her long after she stood up. Even when she turned the corner, even when the mansion disappeared from view, the weight of that moment stayed with her. She replayed it over and over, the man's face, the way people had stepped around him, the way the air seemed to change the second she knelt down. She had crossed an invisible line and she knew it. In her world, kindness was never neutral. It always came with consequences. By the time she reached her apartment, her hands were shaking. Ethan greeted her with a weak smile, his body warm with fever but his eyes bright when he saw her. That smile was the only thing that kept her upright. She moved through the motions on instinct, medicine measured carefully, water poured slowly, pretending that the gnawing ache in her stomach wasn't there. That night sleep came in fragments. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the sidewalk again, the iron gate, the way the man had looked at her when she handed him the last of what she had. There had been something in his expression she couldn't name, not just gratitude, awareness. The next morning, the city felt different. Not visibly, not dramatically, but subtly, like a shift in pressure before a storm. At the diner, customers were sharper than usual, less patient. One man complained about his coffee being too cold, his voice loud enough to draw attention. Another left exact change on the counter without a word, his eyes sliding past Angela like she wasn't there. She absorbed it the way she always did, quietly, internally. Racism rarely announced itself anymore. It showed up in tone, in assumptions, in the way people decided who deserved grace and who didn't. During her break, she noticed whispers. Two coworkers glanced at her, then away. A phone buzzed on the counter, screen briefly visible before being flipped face down. Angela felt a familiar tightening in her chest. The kind that came when you sensed something moving around you, something you weren't being told. By the afternoon, it followed her out the door. As she walked home, a black car slowed beside her, not enough to block her path, just enough to be noticed. The window rolled down slightly. A man inside looked at her for a long moment before driving on without a word. Angela stopped walking, her heart pounding. She told herself it was nothing. Coincidence. Paranoia born from exhaustion. But the feeling didn't leave. That evening, a note was slipped under her door. No envelope, no name, just a single sentence written in neat, deliberate handwriting. Everyone has a price. Angela stared at the words until they blurred. She crumpled the paper in her fist, anger flaring hot and sudden. Whoever had written this hadn't seen her. Not really. They had assumed. They always did. That desperation made people predictable. That poverty meant weakness. She didn't sleep at all that night. Over the next few days, the pressure grew, subtle at first. A coworker asked if it was true she had found someone. A neighbor looked at her a little longer than usual. At Ethan's school, another parent offered a smile that didn't reach their eyes, the kind of smile that carried judgment disguised as curiosity. Angela realized, slowly and painfully, that a story was being told about her, one she had no control over. She tried to keep her distance from the street where everything had started. She avoided looking toward the historic district, but it didn't matter. The consequences had already followed her home. Then he appeared again. Not on the sidewalk, not collapsed, standing, cleaned up but not transformed. The same man, older, composed, watching her from across the street as she exited the diner one evening. For a moment she wondered if hunger had made her imagine him. Then he stepped closer. He didn't touch her, didn't block her path, he simply spoke her name. Hearing it from his mouth sent a chill through her. He thanked her, quietly, sincerely. He told her she had saved his life, that he had never been treated the way she treated him, that he wanted to help her the way she had helped him. Every instinct in Angela screamed no. She knew how help like this worked. It was never free. It came with expectations, power imbalances, invisible strings, especially when offered by someone who now stood in a position far above her. She told him she didn't need anything, that she was fine. He didn't argue. He simply said he understood, and then he said something that made her blood run cold. People had been watching, he said, not just passers-by, cameras, security. The street was well monitored. What she did had been seen. Angela felt the ground shift beneath her. Watched, documented, interpreted. Her kindness hadn't just been noticed. It had been recorded, dissected, turned into something else. The next day, the rumors escalated. A message appeared online, anonymous, vague, suggestive, a struggling woman, an older, wealthy man, a relationship implied without evidence but with enough detail to sound convincing. It spread quietly, then loudly, shared, commented on, judged. Angela didn't see it at first. She felt it, in the way people spoke to her, in the way her supervisor suddenly asked if everything was appropriate, in the way kindness from strangers evaporated overnight. She confronted the man the next time he reached out. Her voice shook with anger she had been holding back for days. She accused him of putting her in danger, of exposing her to scrutiny she never asked for. He looked genuinely shocked, hurt even. He told her he had done nothing, that someone else was responsible, that there were people in his life who didn't like his choices, who saw her not as a person but as a problem. That was when Angela understood. This wasn't just about her act of kindness. It was about control, about class, about who was allowed to cross invisible boundaries and who was punished for it. She pulled away after that, stopped answering calls, declined help, tried to disappear back into the routine she had worked so hard to maintain. But once attention finds you, it doesn't let go easily. The final blow came when a man approached her openly this time, well-dressed, confident, smiling without warmth. He introduced himself as family. He spoke in measured tones about appearances, reputations, consequences. He offered her a deal. Security, stability, everything she had ever needed, in exchange for her cooperation, silence, distance, compliance. Angela listened without interrupting, her hands clenched at her sides. She thought about Ethan, about the years she had spent surviving without help, about the moment on the sidewalk when she had chosen humanity over self-preservation. When the man finished speaking, she looked him in the eye and said no. The smile vanished instantly. As he walked away, he promised her something, not help, not protection. Trouble. And Angela knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her bones, that the worst part of this story hadn't happened yet. The trouble didn't arrive all at once. It crept in slowly, the way it always does when it's meant to break someone down without drawing attention. Angela felt it first in the silences, calls that stopped coming, smiles that disappeared, doors that once opened easily now hesitated before letting her through. At the diner, her schedule changed without explanation. Fewer hours, worse shifts, When she asked why, the manager avoided her eyes and muttered something about keeping things balanced. Balance for whom, Angela wondered. It didn't matter. The result was the same: less money, more pressure, less room to breathe. Customers felt different too. Some stared openly now, others whispered not quietly enough. A woman left a note on the table instead of a tip. It read, "We all know what you're doing." Angela crumpled it and threw it away, her hands shaking, not from shame but from rage. She had done nothing wrong, and yet she was being punished. At Ethan's school, the shift was worse. A teacher asked unnecessary questions about who was authorized to pick him up. Another parent suggested, with forced politeness, that Angela might want to keep certain influences away from school events. The words were vague, but the meaning was sharp and unmistakable. Angela understood the pattern. When black women step outside the narrow roles society assigns them, grateful, invisible, struggling quietly, correction follows. Not loudly, not officially, but persistently, through gossip, through suspicion, through systems that claim neutrality while enforcing control. She tried to shield Ethan from it, but children feel tension even when they don't understand it. He grew quieter, asked fewer questions. One night, as she tucked him into bed, he asked her if she had done something bad. That question broke something inside her. She assured him she hadn't. She held him until he fell asleep, then sat in the dark long after, staring at the wall, fighting the urge to scream. The world had decided to rewrite her story, and she was losing control of the narrative. The wealthy man, the one whose life she had saved, tried to reach her again. She ignored him at first, not because she blamed him, but because proximity to him had become dangerous. Everything connected to him drew attention, scrutiny, power struggles she never agreed to participate in. But the pressure kept building. Another anonymous message appeared online, more explicit this time, accusations layered with implication. The comments were worse. Strangers dissected her life with confidence, reducing her to stereotypes they had always been ready to believe. Gold digger, opportunist, manipulator, words that stuck because society had been trained to accept them without proof. Angela reported the posts. Nothing happened. She asked for help. She was told to ignore it. Ignoring it didn't stop the consequences. One afternoon, she came home to find her door ajar. Nothing was stolen, nothing was broken, but something had been moved. A message without words. Someone had been there. Someone wanted her to know they could reach her anytime they wanted. Fear settled into her bones. That night she called the man she had been avoiding, not for help, for honesty. She needed to understand what forces were moving around her. He listened without interrupting, his silence heavy with something close to regret. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight she hadn't heard before. He told her the truth. He wasn't just wealthy, he was powerful, and power attracted people who believed they were entitled to control his decisions. People who saw Angela not as a person but as a variable, a risk, a threat to inheritance, to legacy, to order. Someone close to him was orchestrating this. Someone who believed fear was an efficient tool. Angela felt sick, not surprised but exhausted. She had lived her whole life under systems that punished the vulnerable to protect the comfortable. This was just another version of the same story, dressed up in suits and influence. She told him she didn't want anything from him, not money, not protection. She just wanted to be left alone. He told her that might not be possible anymore. The next day, the confrontation came. It happened in public deliberately, outside Ethan's school, a place designed to corner her emotionally. The man, the relative, the one with the polished smile, approached her calmly as if they were old acquaintances. He spoke softly, carefully, making sure others could see but not hear. He reminded her of everything she stood to lose: her job, her reputation, her stability, her peace. He told her she was being unreasonable, that cooperation would make everything easier, that resistance would only hurt her child. That was when Angela felt something shift inside her. Fear had carried her through many storms, but this crossed a line. Her son was not leverage. Her motherhood was not a weakness to exploit. She looked at the man and saw him clearly now, not as a threat, but as a symptom of a world that believed power excused cruelty. She refused him again. This time, he didn't hide his anger. Within days, the fallout was immediate. Her hours were cut entirely. A complaint appeared in her employee file, unsubstantiated, vague, enough to justify temporary suspension. Temporary had a way of becoming permanent. Angela stood in her kitchen, staring at the letter, her hands numb. The walls felt closer than ever. She had done everything right, worked hard, stayed quiet, helped when she could, and still the system closed in around her. She thought about giving in, about calling the man and saying yes, about choosing safety over dignity. It would be easier. It would make the fear stop. But then she remembered the sidewalk, the choice she made without thinking, the reason she knelt down in the first place. She hadn't done it for reward. She hadn't done it for recognition. She had done it because she refused to become someone who walked past suffering to protect herself. And she wasn't about to betray that now. Angela made a decision. She would not be silent. She gathered evidence, messages, notes, timelines. She documented everything, even though she knew the odds were against her. Black women were rarely believed when they spoke about abuse of power, especially when the people involved wore respectability like armor. Still, she spoke. She told her story to the one person who could amplify it without twisting it, the man whose life she had saved, not to rescue her, but to stand with her. What Angela didn't know was that this choice, this refusal to disappear quietly, was about to turn a private injustice into a public reckoning. And once the truth surfaced, it wouldn't just threaten her future. It would shake theirs. The moment Angela decided to speak, the world around her seemed to tighten, as if it sensed defiance and moved instinctively to crush it. What had once been whispers became coordinated pressure. What had been subtle became unmistakable. This was no longer about rumors or reputations. This was about power protecting itself. It began with a phone call. Angela answered it without thinking, her hands still damp from washing dishes in the sink. The voice on the other end was calm, professional, almost polite. Too polite. The caller introduced himself as a legal representative, his words carefully chosen, his tone rehearsed. He told her she was being contacted as a courtesy. That phrase alone made her stomach drop. He spoke about misunderstandings, about narratives spiraling out of control, about how dangerous public perception could be for everyone involved, especially her. He reminded her that she was a single mother, that stability was fragile, that systems had rules, and people who challenged them often found themselves isolated very quickly. Angela listened in silence. Then came the warning. He told her that if she continued to share her story, there could be consequences. Not threats, he clarified smoothly, just realities. Employers made decisions. Schools reassessed environments. Landlords reviewed leases. He spoke as if he were describing the weather, not the dismantling of a life. When the call ended, Angela stood frozen in her kitchen, the hum of the refrigerator suddenly deafening. Her heart pounded, but beneath the fear something else was rising. Anger. Not explosive, not reckless, focused. They weren't trying to scare her into silence because she was wrong. They were trying because she was right. Within hours, the escalation became visible. Her suspension from work turned into termination. A brief email citing ongoing concerns and public image arrived without warning. No meeting, no explanation, just a door closing. She stared at the screen until the words lost meaning. By evening, a car was parked across the street from her apartment, engine running, lights off. It stayed there for over an hour. Angela didn't call the police. She knew better. She had learned long ago that not all fear was taken seriously, and not all protection was given equally. Instead, she locked her door, checked on Ethan, and sat beside his bed long after he fell asleep, listening to his breathing as if memorizing it. The next morning, the story broke. Not the version she had lived, but the version power wanted told. An article appeared online, framed as concern: a wealthy elder being manipulated, a vulnerable man taken advantage of by someone with a complicated background. Angela's name wasn't printed, but the details were precise enough to leave no doubt. Comments flooded in within minutes, assumptions hardened into facts, lies repeated until they felt true. Angela watched it unfold from her phone, her hands shaking. This was the moment she had feared, the moment when public opinion solidified before truth ever had a chance. Her phone buzzed constantly, messages from strangers, some cruel, some threatening, a few sympathetic drowned out by the noise. Someone slipped another note under her door, this one shorter, more direct. "Stop." That afternoon she was called into a meeting she hadn't requested, a neutral location, a conference room with glass walls and a long polished table. She almost didn't go, almost stayed home, wrapped herself around Ethan and waited for the storm to pass. But storms like this didn't pass, they consumed. She walked into the room alone. The men waiting for her were calm, confident, dressed in certainty. They spoke about resolution, about making this go away, about how cooperation would be remembered kindly. One of them slid a folder across the table. Inside was everything she stood to gain if she stayed silent, and everything she stood to lose if she didn't. Housing assistance, financial support, guaranteed education for her son. And on the other side, consequences left unspoken but fully understood. Angela looked at the folder, then closed it without opening another page. Her hands were steady now. She surprised herself with that. She told them she would not lie. The temperature in the room changed instantly. The smiles vanished, voices hardened. The conversation shifted from persuasion to pressure. They spoke over her, dismissed her experiences, reduced her to a problem that needed managing. One of them said something she would never forget. He told her this would be easier if she understood her place. That was the moment everything crystallized. This wasn't about protecting anyone. It wasn't about truth or misunderstanding. It was about preserving a hierarchy that depended on people like Angela staying quiet, grateful, and unseen. She stood up. She told them she was done listening, that she would tell her story in her own words, that if they wanted silence, they would have to force it. They didn't stop her from leaving. They didn't have to. By the time she reached home, the final move had already been made. A letter waited on her kitchen table, slid through the mail slot while she was gone, formal, cold, official. It stated that her lease was under review due to ongoing disturbances and safety concerns. She had 30 days. Angela sat down slowly, the room spinning. 30 days, no job, no safety net, a child depending on her. This was the cliff's edge. The moment every system closed ranks against her at once. Angela pressed her palms flat against the table and breathed through the panic threatening to take over. She had known this was possible. She just hadn't known it would come so fast. Her phone buzzed again. A message from the one person who had the power to challenge all of this publicly. The one person whose voice could not be easily dismissed. He had seen everything, and he was ready to speak. Angela stared at the screen, knowing that whatever came next would change everything, irreversibly. Because once the truth was spoken out loud, there would be no going back. The moment the truth went public, the illusion shattered. It didn't arrive quietly. It arrived like a rupture, sudden, violent, impossible to ignore. The man Angela had helped stepped forward with a statement that left no room for misinterpretation. He spoke plainly. No dramatics, no softened edges. He described the experiment, the disguise, the hours spent lying on that sidewalk while the city walked past. He named the fear, the humiliation, the way wealth had insulated people from responsibility. And then he named Angela. Not as a charity case, not as a beneficiary, as the only person who stopped. He described her exhaustion, her hunger, the fact that she had given away what she couldn't afford to lose. He described how she had done it without knowing who he was, without expecting anything in return. He described the aftermath, the pressure placed on her, the intimidation, the attempts to erase her voice. And then he said the words no one expected. He took responsibility for the surveillance, for the silence, for underestimating how violently power reacts when challenged by dignity. Within minutes, the story spread faster than anyone could control. Screens filled with clips, headlines shifted tone midday, comment sections turned volatile. People who had repeated lies now scrambled to revise their stance. Institutions that had remained silent issued carefully worded statements filled with concern and distance. Angela watched it all unfold from her living room, Ethan asleep beside her, unaware that the ground beneath their lives was shifting again. This time not against her, but around her. Her phone rang nonstop. Reporters, advocates, lawyers, people who wanted her story packaged neatly. She ignored them all. She had learned the cost of letting others speak for her. Then the backlash came. The same voices that had tried to silence her now accused her of manipulation, of setting someone up, of orchestrating sympathy. They questioned her motives, her character, her past. Old records were dug up and distorted, innocent moments reframed as evidence of intent. Angela felt the familiar weight of it settle again, the exhaustion of being scrutinized from every angle, the impossible demand to be perfect just to be believed. But this time, something was different. She wasn't alone. Community organizations stepped forward. People who had lived versions of her story recognized the pattern instantly. They named it. They connected the dots. They reminded the public that this wasn't an isolated incident, but a reflection of how power routinely punished vulnerability when it refused to stay quiet. Angela finally agreed to speak, but only once. She stood in front of a room filled with cameras, lights harsh and unforgiving, her heart pounding so loudly she could hear it in her ears. She didn't dress for impact. She dressed for herself. Plain, grounded, real. When she spoke, she didn't beg for understanding. She told the truth. She spoke about working multiple jobs and still being one bill away from disaster, about being seen as suspicious for stopping to help, about how kindness from a black woman was treated as strategy instead of humanity, about how quickly people assumed the worst because it fit a story they were comfortable believing. She spoke about fear, about protecting her child, about how silence had almost cost her everything. And then she said something that cut through the noise. She said she would do it again. She said that even knowing what it cost her, she would still kneel down on that sidewalk. Because if survival required abandoning compassion, then the system demanding that sacrifice was broken beyond repair. The room went silent. Outside, crowds gathered, not in anger but recognition. Signs appeared, messages spread. People who had walked past their own moments of injustice began to talk about them openly. The conversation grew larger than Angela, larger than any one person. The men who had threatened her scrambled to contain the fallout. Meetings were held behind closed doors, statements revised, distances created. One by one, the structures that had closed ranks began to fracture under the weight of exposure. But power doesn't disappear quietly. Late that night, Angela received a final message. No signature, no threat this time, just a reminder. This isn't over. She looked at Ethan sleeping peacefully, his breathing steady for the first time in weeks, and felt a calm settle over her that surprised even herself. Fear was still there, but it no longer controlled her. because whatever came next, the truth was already out. And once seen, it could not be unseen. The final confrontation didn't happen in a courtroom or on a stage. It happened where power felt safest, behind closed doors, in rooms where decisions were usually made without witnesses. By the time Angela was summoned again, the tone had changed. The same people who once spoke to her with controlled authority now moved carefully, measuring every word. The balance had shifted, but it hadn't disappeared. Power was wounded, not defeated, and wounded power is unpredictable. She walked into the building alone, her spine straight, her hands steady. Not because she wasn't afraid, but because fear had already taken everything it could from her. What remained was resolve. Inside, the room felt colder than before. The polished table, the glass walls, the carefully neutral art meant to suggest reason and fairness. The men were there again, some familiar, some new. One chair was empty. That absence said more than any words could. Someone had already been sacrificed to protect the rest. They spoke first. They acknowledged mistakes, miscommunications, poor judgment. They expressed concern for Angela's well-being and for the unintended consequences she had faced. They spoke as if the harm had simply happened, not been engineered, as if systems malfunctioned on their own. Angela listened without interrupting. Then they offered restitution. Not justice, restitution. Her job could be reinstated, her lease issues resolved, financial compensation quietly arranged, no admission of wrongdoing, no accountability, just a path back to stability provided she agreed to one condition. Silence. Not publicly, not officially. Just enough silence to let the moment fade. Angela felt the weight of it press against her chest. This was the crossroads they had been guiding her toward all along. The moment where exhaustion would make compliance tempting, where survival would demand compromise. She thought about Ethan, about the nights she had sat awake listening to his breathing, about the relief that stability would bring, the safety, the chance to finally rest. Then she thought about the sidewalk, the moment she had knelt without calculating cost, the moment that had changed everything. She asked one question. What happens to the next person? The room went still. She asked what would stop this from happening again, to someone without a platform, without support, without a powerful ally willing to speak. No one answered. That silence was her answer. Angela declined the offer. The reaction was immediate, shock quickly masked by irritation. They reminded her again of what she stood to lose. They implied that public support was fleeting, that outrage moved on, that systems endured. Angela stood. She told them she already knew that. She told them she had lived inside those systems her entire life, that she understood exactly how they survived, by convincing people like her that survival required submission. She told them she would not trade her voice for comfort. When she left the room, the air felt lighter, not because the danger was gone, but because the decision had been made. The retaliation came swiftly. Another attempt to discredit her surfaced, a leaked document, a distorted timeline, a renewed push to shift public attention away from the truth and back toward doubt. It was sharper this time, more aggressive. But it didn't land the way they expected. Too many people were watching now. Journalists began asking harder questions. Advocates dug deeper. Patterns emerged, other names, other stories, other silenced voices. Angela's experience was no longer isolated. It was a thread, and people were pulling. The man whose life she had saved stood beside her publicly this time, not as a savior, not as a shield, but as a witness. He named names. He refused to soften his words. He admitted his own failures and challenged others to do the same. The reaction was explosive. Board members resigned. Investigations were announced. Statements retracted. The story expanded beyond anyone's control. The narrative shifted from scandal to reckoning. Still, the cost was real. Angela remained unemployed. The pressure didn't disappear overnight. Some friends distanced themselves, afraid of being caught in the fallout. Hate messages continued to arrive, quieter now but still sharp. There were moments, late at night, when doubt crept back in, when she wondered if she had chosen the harder path unnecessarily, when fear whispered that standing up had only prolonged the suffering. Then she would look at Ethan, healthier, stronger, laughing again. And she would remember why silence was never an option. One evening, weeks after the confrontation, Angela received a letter, not threatening, not transactional, handwritten. It was from someone she didn't know. A woman who had seen the story and recognized herself in it, who had stopped walking past her own moment because of Angela's courage, who had spoken up at work, who had refused to be quiet. Angela folded the letter carefully and held it to her chest. This was the truth they couldn't erase. Change didn't always arrive with applause. Sometimes it arrived quietly, person by person, choice by choice. But it arrived. As the city moved on to the next headline, something fundamental had shifted. The systems that relied on invisibility had been forced into the light, not destroyed, but exposed. And exposure has a way of changing what comes next. Angela stood at her window that night, watching the street below. People passed by, lost in their routines, unaware of the battles fought just beneath the surface. She knew now that injustice didn't always announce itself, but resistance didn't need permission. This wasn't the end of her struggle. It was the beginning of her power. And what came next would determine whether the world truly learned from what it had seen, or whether it would try, once again, to look away. The days after the confrontation felt strangely quiet. Not peaceful, just quiet in the way that follows an earthquake, when the ground has stopped shaking but everyone is still waiting to see what fell, what cracked, and what can never be rebuilt. Angela woke each morning with that same weight in her chest, the familiar tension of uncertainty, but something had changed. The fear no longer owned her. It lingered, yes, but it no longer dictated her choices. Life didn't suddenly become easier. Bills didn't disappear. Opportunities didn't magically line up. The system that had pressed against her for so long did not suddenly transform into something kind. Resolution, Angela learned, was not the same thing as relief. But there was movement. The investigation continued quietly but steadily. Institutions that once ignored complaints now released cautious updates. Language shifted. Words like review, policy, and accountability began appearing where silence once lived. It wasn't justice yet, not fully, but it was acknowledgement. And for people like Angela, acknowledgement had always been the first thing denied. She found work again, not because the world had softened, but because someone had been paying attention. A small organization reached out, one rooted in community rather than profit. The pay wasn't great, but the environment was different. People spoke to her like she existed, like her experience mattered. That alone felt radical. Ethan's health continued to improve, slowly, steadily. His laughter returned in full, unrestrained bursts that filled the apartment and reminded Angela why she had endured so much for so long. He slept through the night now, ate without coughing, asked questions about the world with a curiosity that hadn't yet learned fear. Angela watched him closely, aware that one day he would encounter the same systems that had shaped her life. She wondered how much she could protect him, how much she could prepare him, and how much would always be out of her control. People still recognized her sometimes, not as a headline anymore, but as a symbol. That was uncomfortable. Angela had never asked to represent anything. She had simply refused to walk away. But she understood now that stories had power, especially when they survived attempts to erase them. She received letters and messages from strangers across the country. Some thanked her. Some apologized for not stopping in their own moments. Others shared stories they had never told anyone before. Stories of being watched, judged, punished for compassion. stories that echoed hers so closely it felt like reading different versions of the same life. That was when it fully settled in. What happened to her was not exceptional. It was familiar. Angela began speaking, not everywhere, not endlessly, but intentionally. She chose spaces where listening mattered more than optics. She spoke about how racism often didn't look like hatred, but like indifference, like systems that functioned exactly as designed while insisting they were neutral, like consequences that arrived quietly and were explained away as coincidence. She spoke about how kindness, when shown by the wrong person, was treated as suspicious, how empathy from marginalized people was often reframed as manipulation, how society loved stories of charity, but only when power flowed in one direction. And she spoke about cost. Not just the cost she paid, but the cost of silence. The cost of walking past suffering to protect comfort. The cost of pretending these stories were rare when they were happening every day, unnoticed, unrecorded, unresolved. Angela didn't claim victory. She didn't pretend the system had been fixed. She knew better. Racism didn't collapse because one story was told. It adapted. It always did. But something had shifted inside her. For the first time, she felt aligned with herself. The person she was under pressure matched the person she wanted to be. That alignment brought a quiet strength she had never known. One evening, as the sun dipped below the buildings and the city softened into shadow, Angela stood at the same window where she had once watched the street in fear. The world outside looked unchanged. People hurried past, lost in their routines, their phones, their own struggles. She wondered how many moments of quiet injustice were passing by unnoticed right then. How many choices were being made to stop or not to stop. She thought about that sidewalk again, the moment that fractured her life and rebuilt it into something truer, the choice that cost her so much and gave her something she could never lose. Her voice. Angela knew the story wasn't over, not hers, not anyone. Resolution wasn't an ending, it was a turning point, a place where pain transformed into responsibility. And responsibility, she understood now, was contagious. The ripple effects didn't arrive with headlines anymore. They arrived quietly, in places the cameras never reached, in conversations behind closed doors, in decisions made a little more carefully than before, in moments where someone paused, not because they were brave, but because Angela's story had lodged itself somewhere uncomfortable in their mind. She began to notice it in small ways. At community meetings, people spoke differently. Not perfectly, not always correctly, but more honestly. They stopped using language that erased responsibility. They stopped hiding behind phrases like misunderstanding and both sides. Some still resisted. Some still minimized, but fewer pretended not to see the pattern. Angela learned that change rarely came from dramatic reversals. It came from disruption, from stories that made it harder to look away without consequence. She also learned that visibility was a double-edged thing. Being known meant being watched, scrutinized, reduced at times to a symbol instead of a person. There were days when she missed anonymity, when she missed the simplicity of being ignored. But then she would remember what that invisibility had cost her, and she knew she could never return to it willingly. Racism, she realized, thrived in quiet. It thrived in moments when people convinced themselves that what they were seeing wasn't their responsibility. That discomfort was someone else's problem. That stopping was optional. Her story disrupted that comfort. Angela was invited into rooms she had never been allowed in before, not because she sought power, but because power needed her presence to legitimize its listening. She was careful. She asked questions. She refused to soften her language for the sake of politeness. She reminded people that harm didn't require intention to be real. She talked about how quickly kindness turned into suspicion when it crossed racial and economic lines, about how a black woman offering help was interrogated in ways others never experienced. about how systems punished people not for wrongdoing, but for refusing to stay in the roles assigned to them. Some people listened, some didn't, and that too was part of the truth. Angela stopped measuring success by outcomes she couldn't control. She measured it by integrity, by whether she was telling the truth even when it made rooms uncomfortable, by whether she was modeling for Ethan the kind of courage she wished someone had modeled for her. Ethan asked questions now, more thoughtful ones, about fairness, about why some people had more than others, about why helping someone could cause so much trouble. Angela answered him carefully, honestly, without burdening him with fear, but without lying. She told him that the world wasn't always fair, but that fairness didn't improve when people pretended otherwise. She told him that kindness mattered, even when it cost something, especially then. The story continued to travel, not just through media, but through people. Teachers used it as discussion. Community leaders referenced it without nomming her. Parents talked about it at dinner tables. It became a mirror, reflecting back uncomfortable truths about how society decided who deserved protection and who was expendable. Angela saw herself less and less as the center of it. That mattered. Because the moment a story becomes only about one person, it becomes easier to dismiss, to isolate, to say that was her situation. But this story refused to stay contained. Too many people recognized themselves in it. She received messages from people who had walked past suffering and never forgiven themselves, from people who had stopped and paid the price, from people who were still deciding what they would do if faced with that moment again. That was the impact. Not resolution as closure, but resolution as awakening. Angela understood now that racism didn't always arrive as violence. Sometimes it arrived as policy, as pressure, as reputation quietly dismantled, as fear weaponized to maintain order, and sometimes it arrived as a question. Why did you stop? Angela's answer never changed. Because someone needed to. Because walking away would have cost her more than stopping ever did. As time passed, the intensity of the public conversation softened, but the undercurrent remained. The systems involved never fully admitted guilt. Consequences were partial, carefully managed. Justice, when filtered through power, rarely arrived whole. But neither did silence. Angela no longer needed validation from institutions that had failed her. She had found something sturdier: connection, community, purpose rooted not in recognition but in responsibility. She didn't see herself as brave. She saw herself as awake. And once awake, she knew there was no returning to the comfort of not knowing. She stood one evening on the same street where everything had begun, not because she needed closure but because she wanted to remember. The iron gates were still there, the sidewalk unchanged. People passed by, some pausing, some not. Angela watched carefully. She wondered how many people now carried stories like hers inside them. How many would stop next time? How many would choose differently, not because they were heroes, but because they had learned that neutrality was a myth? The world hadn't been fixed, but it had been challenged. And sometimes that was enough to start something unstoppable. The city never marked the moment when things truly ended. There was no ceremony, no announcement, no clear line separating before from after. Life simply continued, cars moving through intersections, people passing each other on sidewalks, stories unfolding quietly in the spaces between headlines. But for Angela, something fundamental had reached its conclusion. She no longer woke each day bracing for impact. The fear that once sat in her chest like a constant warning had loosened its grip, not because the world had become safe, but because she had learned how to stand inside uncertainty without shrinking herself to survive it. Her life was still modest, the apartment was still small, the work was still demanding, but it was hers again. And that mattered more than comfort ever had. Ethan grew stronger with each passing month. His laughter filled rooms that had once been heavy with worry. He ran now, played without stopping to catch his breath. He carried no memory of the fear that had hovered over his early years, only the warmth of a mother who never walked away, no matter the cost. Angela watched him carefully, knowing that one day he would ask harder questions about the world, about fairness, about why some people were believed and others weren't. When that day came, she would tell him the truth, not just about injustice, but about agency, about the moment she chose to stop and why that choice mattered. She didn't become famous. She didn't become wealthy. She didn't become untouchable. She became honest. The story that once tried to consume her now lived where it belonged, in the collective conscience of people who could no longer claim they didn't know. It appeared in classrooms, in community meetings, in quiet conversations between friends who paused and asked themselves uncomfortable questions. What would I have done? That question mattered more than any verdict. Angela knew the system hadn't been dismantled. Racism didn't vanish because one woman refused to be silent. It adapted. It always would. But it had been forced into the light, and that light changed how it moved. There were still moments of doubt, nights when exhaustion crept in and she wondered if it had been worth it. But then she would remember the sidewalk, the iron gate, the man everyone else walked past, the choice that revealed who she was when no one was watching. She would remember that dignity, once claimed, could not be taken away. Angela stood at her window one final time, watching the city she had learned to read so well. People hurried by, each carrying their own invisible stories. She understood now that injustice wasn't always loud. Often it waited for permission, permission granted through silence, through apathy, through walking past. And resistance wasn't always dramatic. Sometimes it looked like stopping. Sometimes it looked like kneeling down when the world told you to keep moving. Sometimes it looked like telling the truth even when it threatened everything you had. This story did not end because the problem was solved. It ended because a line had been drawn. Between indifference and responsibility. Between comfort and conscience. Between seeing and choosing not to. The question is no longer what Angela did. The question is what happens the next time you see someone the world has decided not to notice. Will you keep walking? Or will you stop?